Back in July 2019, Marvel revealed their slate of Phase 4 projects. There's plenty of announcements that had me excited, namely Thor 4 and Doctor Strange 2, but one announcement that I didn't quite know what to make of at the time was Loki. Don't get me wrong, I like Loki in these movies and Tom Hiddleston plays the character to perfection, but bringing the character back so soon after his death in Infinity War just felt wrong to me. After years of backstabbing those closest to him for his own personal benefit, Loki sacrificing himself to give his brother a chance to escape, felt like the perfect way to end his story to me. And I didn't want this show to come along and undercut that moment. However, I thought the trailers for the show looked pretty interesting, so I went in with an open mind. Now that season 1 is finished, the question I have to ask myself is, did this show justify its existence and win me over? And the answer to both questions is a resounding yes. Loki is not only the best MCU TV show so far, but one of the most creative and ambitious MCU stories to date. So this show follows Loki. Not the Loki who died in Infinity War, but the one who escaped with the Tesseract in Endgame. He is arrested by the TVA, an organisation that oversees and maintains the quote-unquote proper flow of time. Basically, everything we've seen up until this point in the MCU has only happened because the TVA allowed it to. Loki is then recruited by Mobius, a TVA analyst played by Owen Wilson, to help him track down a fugitive variant and help fix the timeline. The key reason why this show works is because Loki is a really interesting protagonist. I really liked how both of the previous MCU shows spent a lot of time giving much needed depth to their main characters, and this show continues with that approach. In this series, Loki has to learn not only to care for others, but to find self-acceptance, and in doing so he has to confront his past actions and assess his true motivations, who he really is, and what he really wants out of life. The TVA tell Loki that his role in the timeline is to bring misery, and to fail so that others can achieve the best versions of themselves, and we've already seen this at play throughout the MCU. We've seen him betray everyone close to him, and we've seen all of his evil schemes come undone, and when he finally deviates from that behaviour at the end of Ragnarok, he's almost immediately killed by Thanos. Simply, Loki is not allowed to win. Hell, the reason he was arrested was because he escaped with a Tesseract in Endgame. Out of all the characters in the MCU, he's been dealt one of the worst hands by the TVA, which is what makes him the perfect protagonist for a show like this. More than anything else, this show is about Loki forging his own destiny, independent of the TVA, and finding his own true glorious purpose. And the journey of self-discovery he goes on is incredibly compelling. One of my concerns going in was that this Loki would be missing a considerable amount of character development, but the show takes what could have easily been a hindrance and managed to weave it into the show in an organic way with the end of files scene. It's honestly one of my favourite moments from the show. We also get to see Loki use some powers that he never really used in the movies, which helps to spice up the show's action a bit. It's decent for the most part, but it can feel like Loki's overall power level and competence fluctuates from scene to scene. Another thing I like is Loki's interactions with Mobius. This show has a lot of scenes where these two characters just talk in an office about ideology and life and the TVA, and even though that might sound quite boring, these are actually some of the best parts of the show. These conversations give both characters a lot of depth, and it also helps that these interactions are usually quite funny. I particularly enjoyed the segment in episode 2 when they're trying to figure out where the variant is hiding. It's also fun to see Loki, someone who's always used to being the smartest guy in the room, be paired up with a guy who knows literally everything about him and can see right through his bluffs. But I think the biggest reason why their dynamic works is because Mobius genuinely believes that Loki can become a better person, which forms the foundation of their friendship throughout the show. And all this is enhanced by Hiddleston's and Wilson's performances. Hiddleston has always been fantastic as Loki, but he's especially great in this as he has more to work with than ever before, while Wilson gives a great performance as a somewhat worn-out everyman with a bit of a mischievous side to him. They play off each other brilliantly, and I can't wait to see more of them together in Season 2. Another thing I really like is how weird and unique this show is. It takes place in a corner of the MCU that is so far removed from everything we've seen before, which gives the show the license to experiment, and as a result there's a lot of solid world building and out there ideas. The aesthetic of the TVA is so visually distinct. I like how purposefully mundane and retro everything looks, considering these guys essentially govern all of time. The direction from Kate Herron is strong, especially at the end of Season 3 with that long take, and the OST from Natalie Holt may be the best soundtrack in the MCU so far. Similarly to WandaVision, this show has a very engaging mystery component to it, and without spoiling anything, I think the show handled this element really well. Information pertaining to the grander mystery is revealed at a gradual rate. However, new questions are posed all the time which keep things engaging, and this is a constant throughout the show, including the finale. And on that finale quickly, this is the first show that the MCU has done that tells me that they are really taking these shows as seriously as the movies. WandaVision and Falcon were both great character studies of their respective leads, but those shows were fairly self-contained and small scale, especially Falcon. However, things go down in the finale of this show that will fundamentally change the MCU as we know it. And even though the stakes in this series are huge by the end, it never gets in the way of the heart of the show, the characters, which is very much appreciated. However, to talk about the show further, I'm going to have to get into spoilers. Skip to this time frame to avoid them. 3, 2, 1, Gator Loki. So this show has a third main character who I haven't mentioned yet because she wasn't in any of the trailers or posters or anything, and that is Sylvie, a female variant of Loki played by Sophia Di Martino. She was arrested by the TVA when she was a child, managed to escape, and has been on the run from them since. And because of her vastly different upbringing, she contrasts with Loki in a number of interesting ways. Her fight choreography is scrappy, while Loki's is more elegant, and their dialogue is written completely differently, for example. Episode 3 serves to introduce us to Sylvie as she and Loki try to escape a doomed planet. And while this episode doesn't move the plot forward beyond this function, there's a lot of nice character work on display here. At the start of the episode, Loki and Sylvie are forced into an uneasy alliance, and it's fun to watch them interact when they're constantly trying to one-up each other. But quickly enough, the show starts pushing them as a couple, which I'm a little bit mixed on. I totally buy that Loki is that much of a narcissist that he would totally fall for himself, and it aids both characters' development as Loki has to learn to put other people before himself, and Sylvie has to learn to trust people. My issue with it is that it all feels a little bit rushed. I get that this season is only 6 episodes long, so everything has to move quite quickly, but I think the show would have benefited from building their relationship more gradually, like they did with Loki and Mobius' friendship. But I can't complain too much because of how well their relationship ties into the finale of the show, but we'll get to that later. While we're here, we might as well talk about the other recurring characters. Miss Minutes is a complete enigma, and it totally works given how weird the show is. And after episode 6, she is now my sleep paralysis demon.
Hey y'all, Scott here.
Hunter B-15's redemption arc was cool, but she doesn't get to do all that much outside of episodes 1 and 4. And then there's Ravonna Renslayer. I like the performance, but I think there's some things that they could have done better with the character. I wish the series actually showed her relationship with Mobius through flashbacks or something, rather than just telling us that they've been friends for a long time. It would have made it sting even more when she eventually prunes him. I also thought that her goals weren't really that well defined in the last few episodes. After discovering that she's a variant and the timekeepers are fake, she understandably wants to find the guy behind the curtain, but for some reason she still retains her blind obedience to the TVA, despite knowing that it's all a lie. I liked her best in episode 4 when she felt most like an on-the-ground antagonist, and it wasn't really clear how much she actually knew about the TVA and the timekeepers and all of that. Speaking of episode 4, it's probably my favourite episode of the season. I think in all of these Marvel shows you can point to one episode around the midpoint that shatters the status quo and raises the stakes dramatically for the protagonists, and these are usually the best episodes in their respective shows for me. For WandaVision, it was the episode where Vision confronts Wanda and Evan Peters shows up, and in Falcon it was the one where Zemo escaped, Lamar died, and Johnny Walker caved a guy's chest in. But out of all the shows so far, I think Loki executes this type of episode the best. In the space of 40 minutes, Loki and Sylvie are arrested, Mobius and B-15 discover their variants, the timekeepers are revealed to be nothing more than mindless puppets, Loki and Mobius get banished to the fucking Shadow Realm, and then Loki wakes up and there's like 4 more Lokis and one of them is an alligator. Holy shit, this episode was fantastic. This is also the part of the series where the TVA take on a fully antagonistic role, but I like how the show doesn't treat this as some sort of massive twist reveal, as there's plenty of implications from the first half of the season that they're a pretty shady organisation. They arrest people for crimes that they have no knowledge of committing. Loki is tried in what's essentially a kangaroo court. Barely anyone in the workforce seems to have actually seen the timekeepers, plus they're all variants who were pretty much kidnapped and mind-wiped, and the entire workplace is littered with propaganda.
Fascism. Wonderful.
Episode 5 was also an amazing episode, especially because it just has this brilliant chaotic energy that epitomises the bizarre nature of the show. All season I was waiting for a moment like the Loki brawl, and when it finally came around it did not disappoint. It's honestly one of the funniest sequences the MCU has ever done. As for the rest of the episode, Gator Loki is the best thing to ever feature in the MCU. All the Easter eggs in the background of the Void were fun to spot, and Richard E. Grant was an absolute scene stealer as classic Loki. The only disappointing thing is that we only got one episode with him, but then again his sacrifice scene is not only one of the best scenes in the show, but one of my favourite moments in the MCU as a whole. And lastly, it's time to talk about that finale. I'd say it's probably the best final episode out of the 3 shows so far, but it's aided by the fact that it's a season finale and thus doesn't have to tie up every loose end. I do appreciate that this show doesn't feel the need to make its last episode one giant action sequence like the other two, and the reason I love it is because Jonathan Majors is phenomenal as He Who Remains. His mannerisms and line delivery perfectly capture this guy who's essentially bored himself to the point of insanity. He just has this incredible stage presence, and even whenever he's just talking about lore for 20 minutes, he holds your attention the entire way. And I think he's a perfect antagonist for a show like this because he's more than just a physical threat. The proposals he makes put Loki and Sylvie at odds with each other, and in doing so we get to see how much each character has grown throughout the season. Loki rejects any and all offers of a throne and is only concerned with Sylvie's well-being. But because Sylvie is still incapable of trusting anyone, she pushes Loki aside and kills He Who Remains anyway, opening up the multiverse and seemingly paving the way for Kang. The episode ends with both characters dejected, fearing now what's to come. The ending of this episode is haunting, and I can't wait to see how Season 2 deals with the fallout of it all. In conclusion, Loki Season 1 is simply glorious. It's a brilliant character study of Loki that made me like the character more than ever before. The first 3 episodes were decent, there was a lot of interesting character development and world building, but as a result they largely acted as setup for what is to come. Episode 4 is when the show really kicks things up a notch, and episodes 5 and 6 maintain that high standard to the very end. The show has great characters, solid world building, decent action, fun humour, and an incredibly engaging mystery that runs throughout. This was the hook that Phase 4 needed, and now I'm more excited than ever to see what's coming next. But there wasn't any Don Cheadle.